So welcome everybody. My name is Renee Schell. I'm the Lander Region Information and Education Specialist for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I will be co-facilitating this meeting tonight with Cody Beers, who is the Public Information Officer for the Wyoming Department of Transportation. Everyone has joined muted, and you'll stay that way except for our speakers throughout the meeting. So we will be asking you to use the chat box to ask your questions and give your feedback after the presentation. Cody will restate this as well, but your chat box, if you've never used it, it should be located at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. If you're on a smartphone or a tablet, you might have to double tap the screen and it'll bring up some options. If it doesn't say right there, chat, you might have to type or press more and then you'll get to the chat box there. Oh, thank you, Julia. Julia's running our PowerPoint tonight, so thank you for forwarding that. We do ask again that you wait until after the presentation to enter any questions or feedback into that chat box. So if you need to take notes during the meeting so you don't forget what you want to say, please feel free to do that. If our feed is coming through a little bit choppy, it really depends on kind of what system you have at home. So some things that might help if you're finding that is to close any other windows or background programs that you have running. And then, although we'd like to see you, that's our preference. If you've got to, turning off your own video will help with your feed of seeing us as well. Lastly, if it just is, you can't use the chat for some reason and it's really, your technical difficulties are prohibiting you from really viewing the presentation, know that this is all being recorded. We're going to post it up on a web page. You'll get that link at the end. There will also be a feedback form there. So if you have more feedback to give or stuff that you didn't want to share here, you'll get a link to that after the meeting. I'll send everyone an email and you'll get the website as well at the end for where that is. So that feedback, the form is up now. The recording should be up by December 11th. And then that feedback form will be open through December 22nd. All right, next slide, Julia. So we have tonight 3 speakers with us, and most of you can read it there, but I'll read it out in case you've got a small screen. So we have Julia Kinch with us. She is the principal and senior ecologist at Eco Resolutions. We have Daryl Lutz. He's the wildlife management coordinator for the Game and Fish in the Lander region. And we have Randy Merritt, who is the district construction engineer for WYDOT out of Basin. So they'll be giving their presentation. It's pretty short, 20-30 minutes. Then we'll go right into questions, and Cody Beers is going to help facilitate questions. And then after questions, we'll get to your feedback. It may help. We had someone comment in our run through when Julia shares the screen. If it's difficult to see because you've got all these people, a couple things that might help above your view of people. You'll have something that either says speaker view or gallery view. And so if you choose speaker view, you should just get to one person. If you're not seeing that at all, at the top of your screen, the very top, you should have something that says view options. And you might want the side-by-side mode. That may make it easier as well. So just some options there to help you view the presentation. And then so you can be thinking, what we really want from you tonight is the kind of what did we miss piece. So you'll hear about the possible mitigations that could happen on this stretch of the highway. And so we want to know, of course, your thoughts and your feedback and the what did we miss? What are we missing? What did we not think of? Yeah, I think that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Randy Merritt from WYDOT, our first speaker.
Thanks, Renee. I'm Randy Merritt with the Wyoming Department of Transportation, and I just want to thank everybody for coming out as we try this virtual online meeting. The role of WYDOT, obviously we are the stewards of the roadway out there, and wildlife vehicle collisions are a big part of that transportation system, something that we would like to get rid of. In the Dubois area especially, we all know there's a history up there. And I think the exciting part of this is being able to partner with the Game and Fish. And what they bring to the table with the data has opened up some new opportunities and new ideas of how to reduce those wildlife collisions and the mitigation strategies. We know that from a YDOT standpoint, it's a safety issue on our roadways. We want to have a safe transportation system. So drivers obviously don't want to hit deer. It's expensive. And there is a safety aspect to the driver and occupants in their vehicle, and also the mortality of our wildlife. You know, we all live in Wyoming, and we cherish them and hold them dear. So again, excited for everybody to be here and to be able to be partners here on this project. With that, I'll turn it over to Daryl Lutz with the Game and Fish.
Thank you, Randy. Yeah, my name is Daryl Lutz. I'm a wildlife management coordinator, a wildlife biologist with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And in the years that I've been in the Lander region, I've been keenly interested, as has the department in general, in trying to address wildlife vehicle collisions around the state, but in particular on this stretch of highway in Dubois. In fact, many of you in the Dubois community have been telling us and asking us for years, what can we do about this? What can we bring to the table and try to reduce the number of mule deer, primarily mule deer that are hit every year on this stretch? So in some respects, this is a culmination of a lot of the input that you've all given us and the requests that you've made to address it. But suffice it to say, this is a really important project to the department. You can see all those logos on your screen right now. I want to thank right up front all the other conservation partners that have partnered with Department of Transportation and the Game and Fish, either as other stewards of our wildlife resource or our land resources, or NGOs that have helped pay for the assessment that has been done or is currently being done on the stretch of highway. But I just want to emphasize that this project, this assessment, and this evening is about getting some mitigations on the ground. This is about developing a mitigation plan for this stretch of highway. So this isn't about just sharing information. It's a lot about sharing information, but I just want to emphasize it's going to culminate in a plan to actually address the issues that are so important to all of us. And it's the result of a lot of effort that's been going on for quite a while, but at least since 2017, when the department and the Wyoming Department of Transportation, the Game and Fish Department and DOT hosted the Wildlife and Roadways Summit in April of 2017. That was a culmination of a lot of work and a lot of collaboration amongst people that are, either managing the roadways or managing the wildlife or otherwise interested in addressing wildlife vehicle collisions statewide. And I bring that up because I want to let you know that this stretch of highway, this Highway 26 in the Dubois area, ranked out #1 in the state. So it's got the attention of folks statewide. And then I also want to remind, especially you folks joining us from Dubois, that DOT and Game and Fish hosted a meeting in Dubois, a workshop in December of 2017, where we sat down for about 3 hours, talked about the issues related to the highway and wildlife vehicle collisions, and asked you, for your input, what you thought the issues were and maybe some potential solutions to reduce them. And so this too is a culmination of that information that you gave us that night. Julia is incorporating that in her assessment. So I just want to bring that up because, we've asked for a lot of your time over the past few years, tonight included, and I just want to ensure that that we've heard what you said and using the information and the input that you've given us for good use. And that's about all I have to say, other than I want to introduce you to Julia Kinch. Julia comes from Colorado, which is a good thing, because she has gained a lot of experience over the past decade or so with these very issues. She has been working with the Colorado Department of Transportation for some time, overseeing projects similar to this. She has designed, recommended, and has seen the development of things like underpasses and overpasses and a whole host of other mitigations that are possible. She has seen what their effects are. She knows what's working and what's not working. And so we feel very fortunate that Julia was interested in working with us here. And so we were able to pull together a budget adequate to get the assessment done by her. And again, thanks to all of you folks that helped us pull that together. So Julia's gonna talk to you tonight about where we're at this point in the assessment with some ideas that she has come up with and that we've discussed, and want to present those to you in a general format. And then just to let you know, this is the first of probably 3 kind of meetings, whether we do the other 2 virtually like we are tonight, or maybe we can do them in person, I don't know, but we'll talk more about that towards the end. So I'm going to hush up and introduce Julia.
Thank you, Daryl. So, hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you all this evening, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us. As Daryl mentioned, I'm an ecologist based out of Golden, Colorado, and for the last 10 years, I've been operating my own consulting firm that focuses exclusively on wildlife corridors and mitigating the impacts of roads on wildlife, and of course, creating safer roads for drivers. So as you can see, that's a pretty niche expertise, but I get to work on this issue on a lot of different levels. I've been involved in large-scale planning projects to identify priorities for mitigation across a region or across a state. I've been involved in a number of stakeholder coordination efforts because there's so many different entities and landowners that have to be involved in these kinds of projects. Wildlife aren't aware of jurisdictional boundaries, so that means we have to be able to work together across those boundaries. I'm also involved in a number of infrastructure design projects, so working closely with engineering teams to ensure that we're designing and constructing the most effective mitigation possible. And then I get to research and monitor those mitigation projects so that we can understand how well are they working or not working, and how can we make them better, and learn some lessons that can be integrated into future projects. So that upper project, or that upper photograph that you see is, I took a interagency study panel out to Highway 9, which is near Kremling, Colorado, where we have a suite of crossing structures. And then that bottom photograph is courtesy of one of our camera traps. Tonight, our goal is to share with you the purpose of developing a mitigation strategy for US 26. A mitigation strategy is a specific plan detailing the types of wildlife mitigation and where to put them to have the greatest impact on reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, while still allowing wildlife to move back and forth across the roadway to access the resources that they need. So this mitigation strategy for US 26 is going to be important so that we can make targeted investments that will give us the greatest bang for the buck. And in some places, that's going to mean investing in more expensive types of mitigation. In others, we want to explore lower cost types of mitigation options that may be appropriate in those areas. So tonight we'd like to present our initial findings and our ideas, and we want to get your input on this, as Renee and Daryl and Randing were saying. We want to hear what other ideas do you have, and what types of opportunities and challenges are there that we should be aware of as we continue to develop this mitigation strategy. So this is a map that was developed by the Wyoming Wildlife and Roads Initiative, and is a partnership among Wyoming Game and Fish, WYDOT, the Nature Conservancy, and the Wyoming Migration Initiative. And you can see the colors here. The The redder colors are a higher number of wildlife vehicle collisions per mile per year. And I circled the Dubois area here, and you can see that that is one of our redder spots on the map. It is one of the highest priorities in the state for reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. And I'm sure a number of you that are here tonight can relate to that as well. So this is a really basic map of our study area, but you can see Togedy Pass up at the upper left side of your screen, and the highway runs diagonally across to the lower right where you see Dubois labeled there. And when we add in the wildlife vehicle collision information, we can start to see where we have concentrations of these types of collisions. So those darker green areas indicate lower concentrations of collisions, while the orange and red colors indicate higher concentrations of collisions. And when we graph that data out, all these collisions, here's what that looks like. So the blue bars are crash data. So those are accidents that have been reported to law enforcement. And the yellow bars represent the reported carcasses that maintenance patrols pick up and clean up off the roadway. Along the bottom are the mileposts, and to orient you a little bit, Togedy Pass is on the left side of the graph around milepost 26. You can see Dubois there near the center around milepost 55. And then for about 10 miles east of town, that's where we see the biggest peak in those types of collisions. Excuse me, I went one too far. So these are the migratory paths of collared deer in this area. And you can see some larger clusters, which indicate where those animals are hanging out for longer periods of time. And you begin to see how some of these clusters are coming up right up against the highway as animals start to settle into their winter home ranges. So this map isn't actually showing those winter home ranges. We're not seeing everything here, but it does start to give us an idea of where animals are coming in towards the highway at the end of their fall migration, and how those concentrations are coming up right against the highway in the same areas where we have those bright red and orange colors indicating those higher concentrations of collisions. And so what I like about this map is that we can look at these data sets together, and the lines that show how the collared animals are moving across the landscape, and then those concentrations of wildlife vehicle collisions. And this really starts to tell the story of what's going on here and why. So then we took all those collar points and looked at just the ones that are located within a mile of either side of the highway and graphed those points by date. So that's what you're looking at in this graph. These are the times when animals are in the vicinity of the highway and therefore most likely to attempt a crossing. Along the bottom of the graph, the numbers represent the day of the year. So from 1 on the left side up to 365 on the right. And we've labeled the seasons: winter, spring migration, summer, and fall migration. And what we're seeing here is that the biggest peak when animals are hanging out in the vicinity of the highway is during fall migration and the first part of winter through December. And then we see that their numbers drop off through most of the rest of winter, because as Greg and Brian, who I'm sure many of you know at Game and Fish, they'll tell you that the herds are interacting most with the highway during migration in that early winter period before they settle into their winter home ranges up in the hills a little bit farther away from the roadway. But then as we start to get into that spring migration, we see those numbers increase again, and we have a second peak during the spring when animals are again hanging out closer to the highway. Then when we get into summer, those numbers do drop off as all our migratory animals have moved off into their summer home ranges, but there still are resident animals in the area that may be in the vicinity of the highway during that period. So those are clearly the time periods when we need to be most concerned about wildlife vehicle collisions. And indeed, when we look at the crash data on a seasonal basis, we see a really similar pattern. The orange line is simply the accidents reported to law enforcement by month. And so this, in essence, is the problem that we're dealing with here on this segment of US 26. So now we'd like to take a moment to circle back to the public meeting that Daryl referenced, held back in December of 2017. And many of you may have participated also in that. That was very much a brainstorming meeting. Folks broke out into smaller groups to discuss the problem, put forth some initial ideas about what to do about it. And during that meeting, people widely recognized that we do have a problem of high levels of wildlife activity combined with heavy traffic volumes, often traveling at high speeds, and including a number of out-of-town drivers that are unfamiliar with the landscape and the wildlife that inhabit it. So some of the solutions that were put forth at that meeting include high fencing, but put up or installed in such a way that it wouldn't disrupt migratory movements. People also mentioned the need for crossing structures, warning signs and reduced speed limits and driver education, as well as maintenance activities to remove roadside vegetation and cover, or to plant unpalatable seed mixes in those roadside areas to detract wildlife from congregating in those areas. Now we're moving forward with this detailed mitigation strategy and working to develop that. And so we're exploring all these ideas further. And what I'd like to do is run through some of these potential mitigation solutions and talk about what works, what doesn't work as well, and what's feasible or cost effective. So let's start with signage. The goal of signage is to increase driver awareness. It's a very low cost mitigation strategy, but unfortunately, it's also not very effective at reducing collisions or ensuring that wildlife can safely move back and forth across a roadway. While targeted or seasonal signage can be a little bit more effective at getting people's attention, signs are generally posted with reference to many miles of roadway, and they can't hold people's attention for that long. So the message is quickly forgotten, if not altogether ignored. Speed limit reductions is another low-cost idea that regularly comes up because it intuitively makes sense. If people just drove slower, there would be fewer collisions. But unfortunately, that hasn't really borne out. And first of all, like I just mentioned with warning signs, reducing the speed limit only has a small effect on driver speed. And then there's a very little correlation between that small reduction in driver speed and the wildlife vehicle collision rate. There was a recently completed study by the Nature Conservancy here in Wyoming that found that speed limit reductions, especially on roads with moderately high traffic volumes, simply don't work because there's just too much traffic for animals to cross successfully. And then the thing that makes speed limit reductions even more complicated is that the speed limit is actually set in statute by the legislature, so it's extremely difficult to change and requires an engineering speed study from WYDOT. Roadway lighting helps drivers to see animals that are approaching or are on the roadway, but unless drivers are already going at a slower speed, there's really little effect on reducing collisions. But in areas that perhaps closer to town where maybe the speed limits are already a little lower and this lighting solution can tie into a city lighting system, in those kinds of situations, this could be a lower cost strategy that might be beneficial and worth consideration. Noise and light deterrents include things like whistles and roadside reflectors. They're meant to deter wildlife from the roadway. And there have been a number of different studies on reflectors in particular, and there have been pretty variable outcomes from those studies, but the overwhelming consensus is that these types of strategies simply don't work, especially over the long term. What we see is that hazing like this, it has some initial impact on deterring wildlife, maybe, but ultimately, if they're really motivated to move into an area, they habituate to that and there's no lasting deterrence. Wildlife detection and driver warning systems consist of some sort of roadside detection system. So that could be like an infrared or a radar or a thermal system. The latter two, radar and thermal, seem to be the most promising types of systems right now. And they detect the presence of animals along the roadside, and that triggers a flashing warning sign so that drivers are alerted to the presence of an animal in the roadway. And what we've seen is some pretty variable results with these types of systems. And some of that is related to the detection system itself. And like I said, the thermal and the radar systems seem a little bit more promising. But I really consider this to be still very experimental. I think over time, they may become increasingly reliable as these technologies improve. But there's still a few things to be aware of. So first, they do require drivers to respond appropriately by slowing down when that sign is flashing. So they need to trust the system. Secondly, these systems are still pretty expensive to install. They're definitely not cheap. And third, because animals are still crossing over the roadway, they are interacting with traffic, and therefore this kind of system has a medium value to wildlife connectivity. By far, the most effective strategy for reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and allowing wildlife to move safely across a road is to build wildlife crossing structures. So that can include underpasses or overpasses with continuous fencing that guides animals to these safe crossing locations and prevents them from accessing the roadway. Wildlife crossing structures are expensive, but depending on what species we're dealing with and the landscape situation, sometimes we can build smaller, cheaper crossings that can also be effective. Other times we really need to invest in larger crossing structures to accommodate the suite of wildlife that are moving through the landscape. So while wildlife crossing structures are one of the more expensive mitigation solutions to implement in areas where we do see high wildlife vehicle collisions rates, they pay for themselves over time by helping to prevent accidents and all the costs associated with those accidents. The average deer vehicle accident is roughly estimated to cost $10,000 in direct costs due to the accident, as well as the value of the wildlife that are killed in those accidents. So when you add up all those costs of all those accidents, we can save money over time by implementing these kinds of mitigation projects. And that doesn't even include all the unquantifiable benefits of healthy and connected wildlife populations. Public education and awareness is something that is often brought up, and this also came up in the last public meeting. It's very difficult to quantify the impacts of an outreach program. But I do believe it really should be a component of every mitigation effort. We should always be communicating with the public and involving the public in these efforts. And that includes locals as well as tourists and people who are simply passing through. We want to reach out to all of those audiences. Public education is something we want to invest in, but it is not a standalone mitigation strategy. Rather, it complements our on-the-ground mitigation. So that's my summary of what our mitigation toolbox looks like and the various things we can do to try to reduce wildlife-related collisions on US 26. And now what I'd like to do is put this in the context of our study on US 26 around Dubois. And as you saw from those maps I shared earlier, we looked at that entire area from Togety Pass to east of Dubois. And now the Togety Pass area is important because those national forest lands provide summer habitat for some animals. And as we also saw on those maps, a number of animals that winter around Dubois migrate through this area during their spring and fall migrations. And the good news is that this portion of our study area still has good connectivity for wildlife, despite the fact that they do have to cross the roadway during their migrations. Animals are able to cross over it and are very seldom hit in this area. So we want to make sure we maintain those conditions, that it's sustainable and remains connected into the future. There are two primary problem areas that we really want to focus on tonight. And the first one of these is on the west side of Dubois, roughly from Stony Point, where we started to see that increase in the collision rate, over to the western town limits. And this area provides important habitat for both migratory and wintering mule deer. We see a pretty high collision rate here of 5.5 wildlife vehicle collisions per mile per year. And as many of you are probably quite familiar, the lands along this portion of the valley are privately owned. We see a lot of farm and ranch lands and irrigated fields that attract wildlife. So for this area, here are some of the ideas that we've been discussing. And first is to work with landowners at select locations where there are stock passes and to optimize those existing culverts that are already there so that they could also be used by wildlife. So this is really a low cost mitigation measure that takes advantage of the infrastructure that's already on the landscape and underneath the roadway. But it largely depends on collaborating with landowners to ensure that these culverts still meet their needs and for containing livestock and so forth. Ultimately, you know, they could be improved by moving some gates and fencing or making it a little more permeable for wildlife to use them opportunistically. And I say opportunistically because we're not talking about installing high wildlife fencing to guide animals to these locations. Instead, again, how can we set back gates or fencing and make it more accessible to wildlife that are already in the area? Or another idea we had in this area was to look at existing right-of-way fencing and identify the best opportunities where we could consider replacing sections of fencing on either side of the roadway with more permeable fencing alternatives. So this, of course, would also require close collaboration with landowners. And the idea here isn't to prevent animals from accessing the highway. We want animals to be able to move across, but to select locations where it makes sense to have them moving more freely, and other areas where perhaps there will still be a barrier there. Animals do learn these locations over time, and what we can do is help prevent animals from becoming trapped in the right-of-way, because when they're trapped between the fencing, they're spending more time in the pavement and in that area, and they're more likely to be hit by a vehicle. So the third thing that we're considering out here is to identify locations where targeted vegetation clearing along the highway may be warranted. So those are areas that attract wildlife and where animals can hide from drivers. And it's that experience where an animal suddenly pops up on the highway and it leaves you little time to react. Then the fourth thing we're talking about here is instituting a dual speed limit signs with daytime speed limit and a nighttime speed limit from November through April. So capturing those migration seasons. Now, I know you heard me say earlier that speed limit reductions aren't very effective and are very difficult to institute. And that is, both of those are true. WIDOT would have to conduct a speed study to be able to deviate from the speed limit that's set in statute. And while speed limit reductions on their own do have very limited effectiveness in reducing wildlife vehicle collisions, as part of this suite of mitigation strategies, it could contribute one small piece of the puzzle to reducing wildlife vehicle collisions and helping increase driver awareness, particularly for those non-resident drivers. So the second area we want to highlight tonight extends from the eastern edges of Dubois for about 10 miles to the east. And this is where we saw that large peak in collision, which amounts to 8.9 wildlife vehicle collisions per mile per year. And that's a rate that is considered very high. This area is primarily deer winter range, and we see that intermixed with residential and commercial activity around Dubois. And then as we travel farther east, the landscape transitions to a more agricultural and residential land uses. So in this area, because of that very high collision rate and due to terrain and construction feasibility, we're considering whether this would be a good place for larger infrastructure investments. So that includes wildlife crossing structures connected with wildlife fencing. And again, as I mentioned earlier, in situations such as this, wildlife crossings can actually pay for themselves over time in terms of the number of accidents that can be prevented. In addition, in this area, we have several places where the highway crosses over the Wind River. So we have bridges that are already crossing over the river in these locations, and those bridges offer opportunities to improve pathways for wildlife under those bridges and to encourage animals to cross under at those locations. And I included a photo here on the bottom to show you what that might look like. So this is an example of white-tailed deer using such a pathway in Montana. There's also, in this section, several existing stock passes, similar to what we talked about in the other segment west of town. And we again could look at opening these culverts up, moving back fencing a little bit or gates and making it a little bit more wildlife permeable. And that's a way to include these existing culverts in our system of wildlife crossings and fencing and provide additional opportunities for wildlife to cross under the roadway. And it's a pretty easy way to do that at a very low cost. So those are our two priority areas, but we're also discussing what might be some complementary measures we could implement to reduce collisions through the rest of the study area. So again, we're looking at how we can take advantage of those existing bridges and culverts that are already out there and simply improve those pathways for wildlife movement, particularly along the river corridor, which is a natural feature that animals commonly travel along. We also discussed that there may be some places where it would be worthwhile to install shorter sections of wildlife fencing to connect into those bridges and guide animals to cross underneath those bridges instead of crossing over the roadway. Again, we're looking at other areas where we might be able to replace sections of right-of-way fence and replace it with more permeable alternatives, as we discussed previously, as well as additional opportunities for vegetation clearing in order to detract animals from hanging out near the highway and to provide better visibility for drivers. So to be clear, any mitigation outside of our priorities is likely pretty far down the road, but this helps us to create a long-term vision for the entire highway corridor. Both our near-term priorities and our long-term vision will require substantial funding to implement. Across the state, WYDOT has been increasingly investing in wildlife mitigation projects from 2017 through 2023. WYDOT has already spent or allocated $33.3 million for wildlife mitigation projects. And while that's a significant investment, state and federal funding sources have not been able to keep pace with all the needs across the state. For this project area, we're fortunate that WYDOT has recognized that this is a really high priority for mitigation, and they have already identified some funding for conceptual design. So this would be essentially to get the ball rolling to implement this mitigation strategy. But it's going to be up to our partnership group and to all of us to help bring additional funds to the table to complete design and construction. And that could include seeking funds from individual donors, from foundations, from our partner agencies and organizations, as well as applying for state and federal safety grants. And I can't stress how important it is to bring supplementary funding to the table to get these kinds of projects built. WYDOT is, of course, a major player in any highway improvement project, but these issues of wildlife and roads, it extends beyond departments of transportation. So if we want to build more of these kinds of projects, we're going to need to raise other sources of funding to help implement them alongside WYDOT. And I can tell you that if we can bring outside money to the table, that will really support WYDOT in getting this project over the finish line. And all of this is going to take time. Here's an outline of what that's going to look like, what the steps we need to go through are. We will be completing this mitigation strategy next summer. As Daryl mentioned, there will be additional opportunities for you to review and provide input on the draft mitigation strategy. Then we will need to get funding for design and environmental review processes. And once we have that final design in hand, then we're going to raise additional funds for construction so that we can actually go out and build this. So you can see that even in a best case scenario, this is going to take a few years. So that concludes what we wanted to share with you tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Cody now to guide the discussion and take your questions. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cody Beers. I'm a public relations specialist with WYDOT, and this is the discussion phase of this meeting. Let's start first with asking your clarifying questions in the chat box, and then we will transition to your feedback. We will read questions and feedback aloud, and if you have lengthy feedback or you'd rather not have anyone here, remember you can use the feedback form at the link you see on the slide right in front of you at wgfd.wyo.gov/Dubois Roads. We will be doing our best during this time of this meeting to make sure we get to all your questions and feedback. If for somehow we miss you, please don't hesitate to type it in again. In addition, all of this will be recorded, as you can see on your screen, including a transcript of the chat. You can find the chat feature at the bottom of your computer screen or on a mobile device by clicking on your screen and then going to those three dots and bringing up chat. So with that being said, we'd be glad to start entertaining your questions. I have a question in from Eleanor Gibson. Why did they put barbed wire around Pete's Pond, which is land and a meeting place for the deer? Sounds like something maybe Daryl could answer.
Boy, Cody, I wished I could. I don't have any idea. Perhaps if there's somebody from Dubois that maybe was associated with Pete's Pond Development could chime in. I don't know.
Yeah, we just basically have a comment in from Paul Bedecker of Dubois saying a late season doe fawn hunting season may help. Can you hear me, Daryl?
Oh yeah, sorry, Cody. Yeah, Paul, thanks for that idea and comment. Certainly, it could help. It certainly would contribute to fewer deer along the roadway, but certainly I think we need to balance, the number of deer that we hope to sustain in this herd unit, and at the same time try to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. So it is a thought. It would work. It might not be the direction we'd like to go with the deer herd, however.
Did we get Brian, Renee? Okay, Brian, we did have a question that involved Pete's Pond there at the east end of Dubois. Eleanor Gibson asked, why did they put a barbed wire fence around Pete's Pond, which is land and a meeting place for deer?
So dogs, the Dubois Angler and Wildlife Group were the ones that were responsible for building that fence when they did their improvements. And more than that, I really can't tell you. I was not involved with planning fencing projects in that area.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We do have a question in from Todd Bollinger. How long do these overpasses or underpasses last before needing significant maintenance? And that sounds like a question for the engineer here tonight, Randy Merritt.
Yeah, thanks for that question. They are much like our bridges out there. We do a little bit of repair here and there on them, but we want a 30 to 50 year life without major significant rehab and overhaul on those. So that is kind of our design that we look at. We have some that last much longer, especially if we don't have traffic going over them, such as an overpass. So there is a maintenance cost. It's small kind of year to year, but I would say about that 50-year lifespan is what you would expect overall before a major overhaul.
Thanks, Randy. We've got a question in from David Fromm of Worland. If one deer stays close to the road As far as deer collar points, I believe this is for you, Julia. Would it report as multiple points on that map? And how do you get to 20,000?
Yeah, so as you remember, that map looks at deer collar points per day, and the collars do, I believe they're set for every 13 hours to take a point. So if an animal is hanging out near the road for multiple days in a row, you are going to have that individual represented more in that graph that I was showing. But I think the point was to show that, you know, even if we're seeing some of the same animals every day, that we have this increase in how many animals on a given day are near the highway. And of course, if it's every 13 hours that they're getting a point, you could even have one animal that is potentially contributing 2 points to that particular day. So it isn't by individual animal, but it's a way to approximate when animals are near the highway and likely to interact with the highway.
Thank you, Julia. Our maintenance foreman in Dubois, Paul Bedecker, just so everyone knows who Paul is. Last year in these areas, we had at this point 182 wildlife vehicle collisions through the end of the year. And as of today, there have been 151, and we still have most of December left to go. So that adds good reasons for being here tonight in this meeting. We've got a question from Kathleen Trainer. Has it been demonstrated that existing stock passages are effective? They appear to have lower ceilings and are dark. That would probably kind of go to Daryl and Randy.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to defer to Julia in this regard. She has a pretty good sense of what works and what doesn't. Julia, do you mind?
Sure, no, I'd be happy to answer that. I think that's a great question. Stock passes are more tunnel-like, and that is a concern. And the good thing about deer, as opposed to elk, is they're a little less finicky. So they will use these smaller passages under a 2-lane road. Is a good situation. When you get to a longer road and that becomes even more tunnel-like, that culvert, then it's less likely that a deer would use that kind of culvert. But these culverts, the ones that I went out and inventoried all of them to check them all out, and they range from about the ones we're concentrating on range from about 7.5 feet high and wide to around 10 feet. I believe that was the largest size. So that's actually a decent size, especially that 10-foot size culverts. That deer can navigate. What we'd expect to see is maybe not as many animals, particularly during migration, using those, but animals either during winter or summer when they're encountering the structure more often and they become more familiar with it more quickly, they will learn to use those. So again, not in as high as numbers as a larger underpass or an overpass, but again, it's kind of another opportunity, and it can also work for other animals. So bobcat, coyote, fox, things like that. Hey, and if I may add, there was another question here that perhaps was addressed. It was addressed to me privately, but I think it's for the group. And the question is, could hunting fees be used for mitigation? And I would defer to you, Daryl, for that.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear that. Say it again real quick, please.
Could hunting fees be used for mitigation?
Could hunting be used as mitigation?
I'm sorry, hunting fees.
Like license sales, Daryl.
Oh, well, yeah, probably not given the regulatory or statutory structure that we have in place, but certainly anything is possible. I guess, at this juncture, if I understood the question right, maybe a potential, there are other avenues where we could garner funding, like the conservation license plate. Am I missing the question?
I think you're hitting it, Daryl.
Yeah, at this point, license fees, that goes into our general fund within the Game and Fish Department. So there is probably some opportunity for some funding to come, on particular projects, but it wouldn't be I don't anticipate a major source of income.
Thank you. David Fromm came back again, and I believe Paul Bedecker answered that question, David. So I'll read your question and then I'll give you Paul's numbers. David says, we appreciate you wanting to maintain herd numbers in the area, but how many are being killed by automobiles? Paul Bedecker, our maintenance foreman, just so everybody understands, our maintenance crews at YDOT, along with Game and Fish, go out and pick up carcasses along the road that have been involved in wildlife vehicle collisions. Last year in 2019, through the entire year, we logged 182 wildlife vehicle crashes and in this area that we're talking about. And as of today, December 8th, we've had 151 wildlife vehicle collisions, and we still have most of December to go. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question from David?
I could add, I don't know precisely for Wyoming, and so Game and Fish might want to comment on this as well. But in Colorado, it's estimated that overall 2% of the population dies from wildlife vehicle collisions. And here in Colorado, that's about equivalent to the number of animals that are hunted every year. So in a given project area such as this, it might be a little bit higher. I don't know exactly, but I'll just put that out there for reference.
Thank you, Julia. We've got a question in from Matthew Adkins. With regard to the comment of interagency coordinations, has anyone coordinated with the Defense Threat Reduction Agency for emerging technology development that this project would serve as a vetting measure? That means free passive IR type equipment for a limited amount of time. Julia, do you know anything about that?
I'll do my best to answer. Short is no, I don't really know anything about that. I can say that, for example, there was a wildlife detection system that was installed near Durango, Colorado several years ago that used a military technology of electromagnetic fields as their detection system. They had a number of issues with it. Some of it related to the technology, some related to other issues. So that is no longer active. I'm not familiar and I'm not aware of any other mitigation projects that have coordinated with the DTRA.
Thank you,
I'm a
Julia.
little concerned. It kind of sounds like a covert government agency.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. So
We can look into it. Thank you, Matthew.
yes, thank you very much. We did get a comment in to talk a little bit about Pete's Pond. Lynn Stewart from Dubois represents the Dogs Group, and he said the reason why there's fencing on the east side of Pete's Pond is because there's private property on that side of the pond. So that makes pretty good sense to try to keep people in the area of Pete's Pond from wandering onto private land. We did get another question, this one from Jared Oakleaf of Lander. Great projects all around. Jared asks if there is a fundraising campaign going on, and also has an account been established to pool donations to these projects. Daryl, you want to take it?
If you don't mind, I'll take a stab at that one first. Anybody else can chime in. But Jared, the answer to your question is at this point, we do not have a fundraising campaign started. It's certainly on the burner, on a back burner, until we get a plan developed and finalized. I think we need to make sure we can present to potential donors and funders what we intend to do first. So I'll just let everybody know that it's our plan to have a draft of the plan available for your review around March of next year, so March of 2021. We'd like your critical review of that draft. We'll take input around that time of year, and then have a final plan, draft of the plan, done by around June of 2021, at which time we'll start project implementation to the extent we can, which includes a fundraising campaign. And I think your suggestion about an account for donations is a good one, and we'll look into that. So thank you.
And thanks, Jared and Daryl, for that question. Remember, folks, you can also submit feedback on the feedback form, which is called out on the slide on the presentation, and comments are due December 22nd. We have a question in from Nick Dobrik, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Nick wants to know if there is a plan to address the increasing whitetail populations and have their impacts to mule deer movement behavior been evaluated?
I figure Randy will answer that one.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for the questions. There isn't a formal plan to address increasing whitetail populations, but as you well know, given the discussions that we've had over the last couple of years, we certainly are aware of the public, or at least some of the public's concern about whitetail numbers, and will continue to address those concerns and opportunities during our season setting process. So we can talk more about that anytime, but certainly during the season setting process in March. And then, to my knowledge, there has been some work done on whitetail mule deer interactions, most recently south of Glenrock. But I don't remember if that specifically addressed how mule deer presence or whitetail presence influence mule deer movement behavior. I'm sure it does to some extent, but in a nutshell, it did. That particular study showed that there's not any appreciable displacement of mule deer from their native habitats. And I think as that question perhaps relates to this project, I think we need to recognize that this has been a problem with mule deer along this roadway, given how they use habitats in the upper Wind River Valley around Dubois for decades, and but most certainly precedes any marked number of whitetails in this area. So I don't think this is an issue that whitetails are creating.
Nick, thank you for your question. Daryl, thank you. This is a question from Chris Colligan, and this one will be for Randy Merritt, our whitetail hunter. Does WYDOT have future highway construction projects and bridge replacements proposed in this area that wildlife crossings could be a part of to reduce mobilization and construction costs?
Thanks, Chris, for that question. The answer is no, not at the moment. We just finished up an overlay. WYDOT has really moved into pavement preservation and not building new big wide roadways or new structures, just trying to maintain what we have there. And so we do not have anything on the horizon that would be in the type of replacing structures or adding that type of infrastructure that we could piggyback onto. This would be a standalone project or series of projects that we would have to design and implement. So I know we like to piggyback on. It does help cut costs, but at this time, fortunately, the roads around Dubois are in good shape, and so we're not planning anything in the near future on them outside of implementing these mitigations.
Thanks, Chris, for that question, and thanks, Randy. And Randy, this is another that drives in at WYDOT, something that would require legislative approval, and that's something we've struggled with on Interstate 80. But could tolls for driving on US 26 meet the financial constraint? And that's a question posed to us by Matthew Adkins.
So again, Cody, I think you hit it there. This is legislative, so this is bigger than what we in this room could take care of, you know, as far as implementing. Tolls are not something that are seen as exciting to most Wyoming residents. And so, you know, that is something that's been tossed around for the issues we have on I-80 and keeping its infrastructure up. Do toll roads pay for themselves? To a point, it helps. But at the same time, it is legislative, and there would have to be laws and statutes that go along with it.
Thank you, Matthew and Randy. We've got another question that talks about YDOT stuff, and this is from Gary Lund, a person who has a long history in Fremont County. And how long does it take to construct an overpass?
So from the time we let a bid to actually getting the contractor out there and building one, it would take one construction season. So basically over a summer. Now to go from where we are today to getting it shovel in the ground is going to take a few years of design and, you know, the NEPA process, environmental stuff, and working with the landowners. So once we get a plan, once we get the money and we get it out, we could do it in a year.
Thanks, Randy. Back to David Fromm from Worland. Some comments. Some funding should be available from auto insurance companies. Dave drove from VO, Utah to Enterprise, Utah recently. One of the things that's been done down there is they paint the word deer across the lane at the location where collisions occur. He lost count at 15 plus in the roughly 25-mile drive. And he said, never has my attention been drawn to a deer problem by a wildlife on road sign along the side of the road in Wyoming like it was to the large lane-filling deer painted on the roadway. David, there'd be places up there, especially east of Dubois, where it'd be solid paint. And I think Daryl and Randy would agree with what I'm saying there.
Yeah, Cody, you know, I think this is an interesting idea that they're doing down in Utah. I'd kind of heard about this. It's a pilot project, I'm sure, and it'd be interesting to see what they come out of it, if it actually reduces the wildlife and vehicle collisions. One concern that there would be from a traffic standpoint is if you're reading the word deer instead of watching where you're going, are you going to run over the next deer? So, you know, again, trying to keep people to driving while they're driving and looking at their surroundings. But this is something that we can definitely follow up on and see what Utah comes up with, you know, how it turns out.
Thanks, David, for those comments. And we'll move on to a former game and fish guy, retired habitat guy, and he has very keen interest, Stephen Kilpatrick does, in mitigation strategies, habitat enhancements, distant from the highway. What Stephen's asking here is at the Fish and Stark Meadows, literally hundreds of deer are attracted there. Is there something we can do with these landowners to implement habitat improvements to attract deer away from the highways? Julia or Daryl, you want to take a run at that one?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab while Julia thinks about it a little bit. But the short answer is absolutely yes. And we have talked about that. No, it wasn't covered here tonight, but certainly will be part of a plan that we come up with. And Steve's right, especially the new meadow below the tank museum has been really impressive with the number of deer that is attracted to it. But it's not, you know, like everything else, it's not always just that simple, because, you know, while we create ice cream patches of good habitats on one side of the road, the deer that are on the other are going to be attracted to it. So may create some problems in that regard too, with critters crossing the highway to get to those ice cream patches. But it's a good thought, and it certainly is part of our thinking.
Yeah, I'll just add that regardless of habitat improvements, both during the migration, of course, animals are going to need to cross the roadway, depending on where their summer range is relative to where they're wintering. And then also, you know, one thing that Greg Anderson and I have talked about a lot is how when deer are coming into the Dubois area at the end of their migration, and they tend to congregate along the river, which is also in these areas that you're talking about, where we have a lot of these irrigated fields and other attractants, and there are these irrigated fields, but there's also just the river itself. There's other attractants. There's sort of this whole behavioral thing going on where they're kind of coming down into the valley, and then when they actually settle into their winter range, it is a little bit farther from the highway. So there might be some very specific opportunities for these kinds of habitat enhancements, but I think as Daryl's mentioned, you know, it's something that would have to be investigated much more carefully and much more closely to figure out where that is appropriate, and other cases where maybe it isn't.
Stephen, thanks for the question. Julie and Daryl, thank you. We do have a question from Karen Sullivan asking the funding for the wildlife crossings. Could some of that come from the sale of the conservation license plates?
Yeah, Cody, I can take that one. First, the answer is absolutely. And that money is going to crossings throughout the state or other mitigation measures, but it is highly underfunded. For example, we are putting together a project down by Marbleton and Big Piney, and it's for the fencing, the cattle guards, and 8 crossings. We're between $17 and $19 million right now just for that project. That's a lot of license plates we'd have to sell. So yes, we are using that. There are strings tied to that money. There's some legislation tied to that money. So it's not quite as dynamic to just say, well, let's go grab it and use it. And then at the same time, it's definitely not enough to meet the needs across the state of Wyoming. So, you know, funding is something that we're going to have to come up with. We're going to have to crack that nut.
But I just want to stress what
Go ahead, Daryl.
is, and that is the purpose for those license plate is exactly what we're doing here in Dubois. So that is the purpose of it. Yes, there will likely be some available for this project, but we're going to need to go after a whole lot more, or everybody needs to buy like 5 plates each.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Daryl. As of this last Friday, I believe we're sitting at about 1,850 license plates. The goal sold so far, the conservation plates, and the goal is to get to 2,000 by the end of December. So please buy plenty of those.
Hey, Cody, I just got an update really quick from our planning engineer in Cheyenne. He said right now there's been about $394,000 raised just from the sale of those plates.
Okay, thanks, Randy.
Which is outstanding. It's $250,000 we didn't have before. So it's all good. We just need to step it up.
This is a question from Seth Hallman. Has there been any notable increase in collisions since the speed limit was increased several years ago?
Yeah, Cody, I can take that one too. So 2 segments that we looked at, one east of Dubois, one west of Dubois. The portion east of Dubois, there was not an increase in speed limit out there. When the speed limit was jumped to 70, through engineering study, as Julia mentioned, we did move through the statutes in the state that allowed us to deviate from the 70 mile an hour, and the engineering study did justify maintaining 65 miles an hour in there. So again, that's our highest area of wildlife vehicle collisions, and the speed did not change as far as what was posted out there. Now west of Dubois, it did go from 65 to 70, but no, we haven't seen a huge spike in deer and wildlife vehicle collisions. Mainly, I would say that just because the speed limit was raised didn't mean that drivers weren't already going 70 or better out there anyway. So we haven't seen an increase of driving speed. We just saw an increase of speed limit, if that makes sense. And then the other things we have to tease out of that with all these numbers is herd population, how much, the winter, was it hard or not? What is the concentration of the animals around the roadway and for how long? So there's a lot of things that go into wildlife and vehicle collisions and how many are each year. So, and speed is just one of those factors.
Thanks, Randy, and appreciate that question, Seth. We've got another question from Michelle Burdick. Other than the bridges across the Wind River, have the engineers with Game and Fish or YDOT looked into high-density crossing areas that would allow for underpasses or overpasses?
I can take that, Cody. That's something that we are looking at through this mitigation strategy, is where are there perhaps places where it makes sense to build underpasses or overpasses and connect those in to those bridges that are crossing over the Wind River. So creating a system of wildlife crossings, the bridges, and the fencing connecting it over a longer stretch of roadway. So we didn't get into the details of specific locations, but really that in that segment that I mentioned, east of Dubois, that is where we're considering that might be a really good area to look at wildlife crossing structures.
Thanks, Julia. Appreciate the question, Michelle. Kathleen Trainer asked another question, and she's actually got a pretty good, interesting idea. She wonders, in the area of Red Rocks, if the landowners thought it'd be okay. Would it be possible to install a solar watering system in addition to planting unpalatable grasses along the roadside? Though she hasn't seen deer, she's seen bighorn sheep crossing the road, jumping the fence along the river, and proceeding to drinking in the river. She's seen a lot of deer about a mile east of this location too. So, Daryl, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, Cody, I'm not going to take it. I'm going to ask Greg Anderson to take that question, because his Bighorn Sheep Technical Committee has addressed this very suggestion. Greg, would you mind?
Let me find Greg. Give me just a minute. I'll ask him to unmute. Okay,
Thank
did
you.
it.
Did you find him, Renee?
I did. I've sent him a little thing that says ask to unmute. There he goes.
Oh, yep, I think I unmuted. So this is Greg Anderson, the wildlife biologist for that area. Yeah, Kathy, a couple of years, well, going on 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, we did try to develop some water on the BLM lands on the Red Rock side of where you're talking about. There is, we tried to drill a well, and that was ineffective. Not to say that water couldn't be developed up there, but we've also coordinated with the tribe several years ago. And yep, that's still on the table as far as water development right there near Red Rocks. As you know, one of the things those sheep are crossing the road for is water. We've looked at improving where Red Creek comes out, where it's a deep cut and full of brushy vegetation that's not suitable for sheep drinking in there. So I think that'll probably be part of this project down the road.
Thanks for jumping in there, Greg, and thanks, Kathy, for your question. Paul Bedecker brings us some comments, and we do this all over the region, but we're trying to do more mowing fence to fence in these areas where we have the high wildlife vehicle collisions, and that has seemed to help drivers at least to see the deer before they get close to the roadway. Going to try to re-ask a question, and maybe Daryl or Randy, the question about insurance companies having maybe money involved in this. Have we explored this? And because we seem to get this question quite often.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that real quick, Randy. And the reason I want to try to address that is because as YDOT and Game and Fish planned the Wyoming Wildlife and Roadway Summit in 2017, we did approach the auto insurance industry, and I don't remember there's a like a commission, And we approached them and they had no interest in even in participating with us, even in just a summit to talk about the issue. So I don't know that they wouldn't be interested, but I've also worked with the Westwide Mule Deer Committee, who has also tried to engage with the insurance industry on this issue, but on a Westwide basis, and we just can't seem to get any traction there. So if anybody has any suggestions how to do that, we think it's a good idea. We just need to figure out a way to make it, I guess, more interesting or more impactful for them. And I don't know how to do that.
Daryl, I'll follow up on that. I think the one place where we have seen a little bit of success in working with the insurance companies is on education efforts, that they're willing to help put some education efforts and put their names on them or brochures or whatever and get those out there. I wish I could speak to this a little bit better, but I was at a presentation once from that was given by a representative of some organization that works with insurance companies. So he wasn't specifically with an insurance company, but he kind of represented them, if you will. And I guess the bottom line is, and I apologize that I can't tell you the why, but the bottom line is he was like, insurance companies are not going to fund this kind of mitigation. It's really not, totally in their financial interest, and they basically aren't going to. So I think we can look to them for some things. But even though it seems like we should be able to bring them to the table, nobody's had any success in it, even despite all of our attempts at trying to communicate with them. And, we've pretty much been told flat out that it's not going to happen. So apologies, I can't give more details there.
Thanks,
Yeah, Cody,
Julie.
if you don't mind, it also brings to mind, and it's kind of unrelated, but it's interesting, is that when we were planning that summit and had the word out, I don't know how the trucking association got word of our summit, but they actually contacted us and asked us how they could help. So not insurance companies, but a trucking association was interested, which I thought was admirable.
Yeah, and I will say Colorado held a summit similar to the one that Wydell held a couple of years ago, and was really focusing on partnerships and reaching out to new kinds of partners. And I do think there is a lot of opportunity for reaching out to folks that we, like you were suggesting, Daryl, that we typically haven't been involved in these types of issues. And so I think there's a lot of room for growth there and new partnerships, and which hopefully can also equate to some new funding sources.
Thank you, Julie and Daryl. And we did receive word from Paul Bedecker, and you can see it in your comments that since this meeting started, Paul has received word that 2 more deer have been involved in wildlife vehicle collisions tonight, and that's never good for the deer or the person involved. It's a very expensive crash. We did get a question from Matt Adkins. Given the problem across most of the Rocky Mountains, are the states cross-coordinating strategies? In addition, would a multi-state movement gain support for federal grants?
I can take a crack at that. Matthew's correct. There are really all the Western states are talking about this issue and are to some degree or another implementing strategies to address it. I think we're really just at the point of beginning to talk across state lines around needs where it's the same herd and it crosses into Utah and Colorado, or Colorado and Wyoming and Montana. Just beginning to have those conversations, because again, the animals are moving across state lines, and I-80 is a really good example of that, of how I-80 can be a really big barrier to wildlife movement. And those are animals that historically would move through northern Colorado and Wyoming. And right now they're largely prevented from that, although there has been mitigation implemented in that area that is improving that. So, but to the degree that you're talking about of a multi-state strategy, I think we're really far away from that, quite frankly. Right now, you know, states are, you know, even within a state, sometimes we're competing for the same grant funds. So I think it would take a real sea change in order to be able to create that, in order to have states coordinate at a funding level for a particular kind of grant, or, you know, to improve funding. But I think states and policy is being developed to help improve the funding sources and make that more broadly available across states. So working together to increase those funding sources, and through things like the transportation bill, or you know, wildlife corridors related policies. So I see it happening more in that context rather than a multi-state strategy. But who knows in the future where we'll go with that.
Julia, thank you for that response. And Matthew, thank you for the question. We did get a question in from a person who calls themselves Fire Tablet, and I'm sure that's about their device. But this person wants to know, why does it cost over $5,000 per deer? Can you explain that one, Daryl?
Why does it cost over why does a vehicle collision with a deer cost over 5,000? Is that the question?
Yeah, why don't you, I mean, I hit a deer with my pickup west of Dubois. The bill was, and this was 10 years ago, was $9,800 to fix my truck. I'm wondering if he's talking about the cost per deer lost, Daryl.
Well, I know at least part of that cost includes what we as a state value a deer in terms of its restitution to the state. So I'm not really sure where the 5,000 comes from, but if it's the cost of the deer, part of that is restitution value. I apologize. That's probably not answering your question.
I can take a stab at that if, again, assuming that I understand the question properly, but I mentioned earlier in the presentation that, you know, roughly the cost of an accident with a deer was $10,000. So that number comes from a study from Western Transportation Institute, Marcel Hauser. And that what they did is they looked at the overall costs of a collision. So the DOT actually has crash costs also that include all the direct costs associated with a collision. And in their study, they kind of calculated a per accident cost depending on species. So they calculated a number for elk and for deer and for moose. And so that number for deer is what was used to calculate the cost of collisions to the state of Wyoming. And that is for a deer vehicle collision, which includes the cost of the value of that animal to society.
Thank you, Julie and Daryl. Appreciate the question. Another question from Stephen Kilpatrick. 2017, one of the mitigative measures mentioned during that public meeting was the use of foliage detractions or sprays adjacent to the highway. Stephen says these detractions work best in an arid environment similar to Dubois, where it doesn't have to be reapplied due to precipitation. This mitigative measure was not mentioned tonight. Has it been considered no longer feasible?
Yeah, Cody, I can take that. We did look and discuss this. Obviously, if our deer are not standing in the right of way, munching along on grass, they might not want to be there. The issue with some of the sprays and things that we talked about is then we get erosion off of the roadway. As we get sheet flows of rain and stuff that come off the pavement, it starts to erode alongside the roadway, causing steep drop-offs and that kind of stuff. If a car was to exit the roadway, you know, it could be a hazard for them. Also, then that silt and sediment that is washing off along with the sprays and end out either in somebody's field or in other waterways. And so it can have some negative impacts there. We do plant unpalatable species when we have construction projects. But as you drive around, you notice there's a bit of alfalfa and other grasses that start to creep into the right of way. So yeah, we're still trying to figure that one out. It's a good idea. We just got to figure out how to keep some of those things that the deer are liking out of the right of way a little better. But sterilization, killing off the right of way, really isn't feasible because of some of the environmental and safety aspects.
Thanks, Stephen and Randy. And we do have a question from David Fromm, basically involving trying to fence wildlife to specific locations. He says if most of the area is installed with high sheep type fencing, wouldn't that focus animal crossings to specific locations where the fences were more able to be crossed? Some of those could be existing bridges or crossings. There would have to be ramps for animals to get out of the roadway in those areas. Obviously, you guys have probably talked about this. What's involved in this area and possibly using fence to direct these animals to specific crossing areas? And that would that work here?
Yeah, so we have talked about this a little bit, and certainly we use that kind of high fencing in conjunction with wildlife crossing structures, so and guiding animals to those specific locations. So that is part of the conversation. At this time, we're not talking about installing high fencing and then simply having a gap in the fencing or a more permeable fence there. So the only place I know of where that particular strategy is being discussed and has not yet been implemented, but it is actually a project that will be constructed, is in northern Colorado, north of Craig. And so they will be monitoring this and looking at if we have, say, a section of high fence that goes around a curve in areas where drivers have poor visibility, and then we have a gap in the fence for about a mile through a straightaway where drivers have better visibility and you have targeted signage in those areas. So this is it's in that context, it's untested. It's not going to, again, animals are still crossing over the roadway, but in that part of northern Colorado, we have the largest migratory herds in the country. And so accommodating those movements is a real concern. And this, of course, is much less expensive than constructing crossing structures. So I think in short, it's something we've talked about a little bit conceptually, but not specifically at this point. We haven't talked about specifically implementing that in this particular corridor. We are talking, as what I was describing was, we recognize that the right-of-way fencing itself, especially where it is a sheep-type fence, the woven wire, that is already a barrier to wildlife movement, especially to fawns. And so in some areas, we're saying, okay, well, there will be this barrier, but are there other places where we can kind of lessen that barrier by replacing it with a more wildlife friendly alternative? And sort of in a similar way, encouraging animals to find and use those crossing locations where the fencing is more permeable.
Thank you, Juliet. Daryl, do you want to weigh in on this? I know that there is some concern that fencing tends to separate herds and create new herd units. And down on I-80, that's some of that high fence has done that through time.
Yeah, no, Cody, I appreciate you bringing that up, because one of the things that we are keenly concerned about is not just, mitigating for the wildlife vehicle collisions, but we also have to be concerned about making sure that the wildlife can still use the habitats that they have available to them along and on each side of the highway. So we want to make sure that there's fewer collisions by separating the deer from the roadway, but still allowing for wildlife to move across that roadway. So habitat use is one of our primary concerns and considerations here as well.
Thanks, Daryl, and appreciate the comments, David. We did get a clarification in from Stephen Kilpatrick. what he was trying to say with the detractant sprays, and I think this kind of goes to you, Randy, is they do not kill vegetation. They just make it unattractive. Tastes bad. Tastes like hot pepper components. The vegetation remains, and there's no erosion issue with these type of sprays.
So first, thanks for the comment. This is something I was unaware was out on the market and available. So I think that's something that we can definitely throw into our discussion and see, you know, if it's feasible. Is there something that we could do with this in certain areas? So I appreciate that, Stephen.
And I guess I'd just like to say that, you know, some of those detractant sprays have been used like in urban areas with decorative shrubs and things like that. And while I think there's some short-term deterrent for deer, it doesn't seem to be a long-term solution. So I don't know that it would be very effective, but if there's some information out there I'm unaware of, I'd like to see it.
Yeah, that's generally the conclusion with all types of detractants. And I can't speak specifically to these kinds of sprays, but in general, that is the issue with most kinds of detractants that we've seen. It's just not a long-term solution.
Thank you for all your response, and Stephen, we appreciate your comments. We don't have any new questions coming in, but we want to make sure that to let everyone know that you can still submit feedback following this meeting. There's an online feedback form at WGFD. It's actually the slide that's right on your screen, wgfd.wyo.gov/Dubois Roads. And those comments are due on that feedback form, and we'll be saving all these comments. This entire presentation and the chat has been saved, but those comments are due on December 22nd, later this month. So with that being said, it doesn't look like we're getting any more questions. I'd like to turn it over to Daryl for our closing remarks.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Cody, and boy, thank all of you for taking time out of your night tonight to be with us. Wished we could have done this in person. It's certainly got 2020 is almost over. Maybe things are going to get better in 2021. I'm hopeful. Would certainly look forward, perhaps at the next time we get together to talk about the draft plan, that we can do that in person. And again, just remind you that we're going to take the input that we've heard tonight. We're going to flush out a draft mitigation plan with some specific details and in terms of mitigations that we think would work best and where they would work best along this stretch of highway. We hope to have that to you again in March of 2021. So be looking for that and keep that in the back of your mind. Certainly we will be reminding you and we will get that draft plan to you. And again, really looking forward to your review of it and helping us make it better. That's the purpose of this process and these opportunities to interact like this. And then again, we will we'll walk away from that March meeting and take your input and improve the plan, make it better, and have a final out in June. So the project is moving forward. I know that there's been some folks that want to get this going just as fast as we can. We're working on it. We want to make sure we do it right. This is expensive. It's a lot of time investment. It's a lot of resource investment. So that's the purpose of hiring Julia with a lot of experience doing these projects to get it right. So let's just take a few more months and get this plan in place, and then we'll hit the ground. We'll hit the ground to running in June. So starting next summer. I want to make sure that I extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to all our conservation partners, including the NGOs that have the foresight and the generosity to have made this assessment and this work possible. So thanks again. And with that, again, just look forward to seeing you all in March. And on behalf of the Game and Fish Department And the Wyoming Department of Transportation, we wish you all a safe remainder of 2020 and happy holidays and Merry Christmas. Thank you.